Every phone call you make, every email you send, every website you visit, there is a very real possibility that someone, somewhere, is watching. And for decades, governments around the world went to extraordinary lengths to make sure you never found out. Tonight, we're going to trace the hidden history of mass surveillance, from the earliest days of intercepted telegrams to the vast digital dragnet that touches nearly every person on the planet. And we're going to meet the whistleblowers who risked everything to tell you the truth. To understand how deep the roots of government surveillance really go, you have to travel back to the closing days of the Second World War, to a moment when the ink on the peace treaties was barely dry and the Cold War was just beginning to take shape. In 1945, the United States military made a quiet request to three of the largest telegraph companies in the country: Western Union, RCA Global, and AT&T World Communications. The request was simple on its face, but staggering in its implications. The government wanted copies, physical copies, of every single international telegram entering or leaving the United States. Not some of them, not the ones connected to known threats, but all of them. Every message that passed through those companies' wires would be photographed, copied, and handed over to military intelligence for analysis. The companies agreed. There were no court orders, no warrants, and no public debate. The program was given the code name Shamrock, and for the next 3 decades, it would operate in total secrecy, becoming one of the longest-running and most sweeping surveillance operations in American history. At its peak, Shamrock involved the collection of roughly 150,000 messages per month. Analysts would comb through the flood of telegrams looking for anything that might be relevant to national security, but the sheer volume of material meant that vast quantities of entirely innocent, private communications were swept up alongside whatever intelligence the government was looking for. In 1952, President Harry Truman formalized the signals intelligence apparatus by creating the National Security Agency, and Shamrock was folded into the NSA's expanding portfolio. The program continued without pause, its existence unknown to all but a handful of officials and executives at the cooperating companies. The American public had no idea that their international communications were being systematically copied and read by their own government. Then came the 1960s, and with them, the social upheaval that would eventually pull back the curtain on these secret programs. As anti-Vietnam War protests swept the nation and the civil rights movement challenged the established order, the NSA launched a companion program called Minaret. If Shamrock was the vacuum cleaner that sucked up the communications, Minaret was the filter that picked out specific names and watched them closely. Under Minaret, the NSA maintained what it called a watch list, a roster of American citizens whose communications were flagged for special attention. And the names on that list had nothing to do with espionage or foreign threats. They were activists, protesters, journalists, and political dissidents. The watch list included some of the most prominent Americans of the era. Martin Luther King Jr. was on it. So was Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion who had refused to be drafted into the Vietnam War. Actress Jane Fonda, a vocal critic of the war, was there too. Folk singer Joan Baez, whose music had become an anthem for the anti-war movement, found her name alongside members of Congress who had expressed dissent. Even Senator Frank Church of Idaho, who would later play a crucial role in exposing these very programs, was being monitored by the NSA under Minaret. The Army had its own domestic surveillance program running simultaneously. Military intelligence officers attended protests, photographed participants, and compiled dossiers on American citizens exercising their constitutional right to assemble and speak freely. Christopher Pyle, an Army intelligence officer, first blew the whistle on this military surveillance in January 1970, publishing an article that revealed the extent to which the Army was spying on the civilian population. His revelations sent shockwaves through Congress, but the full picture of domestic spying was still years away from coming into focus. While the NSA was quietly intercepting telegrams and building watch lists, another agency was conducting its own covert war against American citizens, and doing so with a ruthlessness that would shock the nation when the truth finally came to light. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under the iron-fisted leadership of Director J. Edgar Hoover, had been running a secret program since 1956, a program so sensitive that its very name was classified. It was called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, and it went far beyond mere surveillance. COINTELPRO was designed to infiltrate, discredit, disrupt, and ultimately destroy domestic organizations that Hoover deemed subversive. The targets were breathtaking in their breadth. The Communist Party of the United States was the initial focus, but the program rapidly expanded to engulf the Civil Rights Movement, the Anti-Vietnam War Movement, the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, feminist organizations, and student groups. Under COINTELPRO, FBI agents didn't just watch these groups. They actively worked to tear them apart from the inside. Agents planted informants within organizations, spread false rumors to create internal divisions, sent anonymous threatening letters, arranged for activists to be fired from their jobs, and in some of the most disturbing cases, the FBI's actions contributed to real-world violence and even death. One of COINTELPRO's most sustained targets was Martin Luther King Jr. himself. Hoover considered King the most dangerous Negro in America and devoted enormous resources to destroying him. FBI agents placed wiretaps on King's home and office phones, bugged his hotel rooms across the country, and compiled extensive recordings of his private conversations. The Bureau then used those recordings in one of the most grotesque episodes of government overreach in American history. In November 1964, just weeks before King was due to accept the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI mailed a package to King's home. Inside was a compilation tape of his private conversations, along with an anonymous letter that has since been widely interpreted as an attempt to drive King to take his own life. The letter, written to appear as though it came from a disillusioned follower, told King that he was a fraud and warned him that his activities would be exposed to the nation. It ended with a thinly veiled ultimatum suggesting that King had only one way out. Coretta Scott King opened the package. The letter is now preserved in the National Archives, a chilling artifact of what happens when a government agency is allowed to operate without oversight or accountability. The case of Fred Hampton is perhaps the most chilling example of COINTELPRO's capacity for lethal consequences. Hampton was a 21-year-old leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, a charismatic organizer who had been bringing together rival gangs and building community programs like free breakfast initiatives for children. The FBI considered him a threat, and through its COINTELPRO operations, the Bureau provided a detailed floor plan of Hampton's apartment to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. In December 1969, a team of 14 officers raided the apartment in the early morning hours while Hampton slept, firing nearly 100 rounds into the walls and furniture. Hampton was killed in the raid, shot in his bed, along with fellow Panther Mark Clark. Evidence later showed that Hampton had been drugged by an FBI informant named William O'Neill before the raid, making it nearly impossible for him to wake or defend himself. The Panthers inside the apartment fired a single shot. the police fired between 82 and 99. A federal grand jury later found that the raid had been orchestrated with the direct involvement of the FBI, and a civil lawsuit resulted in a settlement of $1.85 million paid to the families of Hampton and Clark. But no officer and no FBI agent was ever criminally charged. For 15 years, COINTELPRO operated in the shadows, completely unknown to the American public. But on the night of March 8, 1971, that secrecy came to an abrupt and dramatic end. A group of 8 anti-war activists, calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, had been planning something audacious for months. They had chosen their target carefully, a small, relatively unguarded FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, a quiet suburb just outside Philadelphia, and they had chosen their date with equal care. March 8, 1971 was the night of the so-called Fight of the Century, the legendary boxing match between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden in New York. The activists knew that virtually every FBI agent and police officer in the region would be glued to their radios listening to the fight. The group included a cab driver named Keith Forsyth, a professor of religion named John Raines, his wife Bonnie, who worked in daycare, and several others. Forsyth, who had taught himself to pick locks by practicing on the doors of a building at a local college campus, was the one who got them inside. Dressed in suits and ties and carrying suitcases, the group walked into the FBI office, loaded every single file they could find into their bags, and walked out into the night. They took more than 1,000 classified documents. Over the following weeks, the group carefully sorted through the stolen files and began mailing selected documents to journalists. Most news organizations refused to publish them, fearing the consequences. But the Washington Post, after confirming the documents' authenticity, ran a front-page story on March 24, 1971. And within those files was a word that no member of the public had ever seen before, a word stamped on internal FBI memoranda that would become synonymous with government abuse of power: COINTELPRO. The documents revealed the full scope of the FBI's war on dissent. One memo instructed agents to enhance the paranoia among activist groups by making them believe there was an FBI agent behind every mailbox. Another directed agents in Philadelphia to monitor the customers of what were described as Afro-American type bookstores, and to recruit informants within what the memo called the Negro Militant Movement. J. Edgar Hoover was furious. He launched a massive manhunt, deploying hundreds of agents to find the burglars, but the investigation dragged on for 5 years without identifying a single member of the group. The FBI closed the case in 1976 without a single arrest. Remarkably, the identities of the burglars remained a secret for over 4 decades. It wasn't until 2014, when journalist Betty Metzger published her book, The Burglary, that 5 of the 8 activists agreed to publicly reveal themselves. By then, the statute of limitations had long expired, and they were celebrated as heroes of American democracy. As John Raines said in a television interview, waving at the camera, from one whistleblower to another, "Hi," sending a greeting to Edward Snowden, who was by then living in exile in Russia. The COINTELPRO revelations, combined with the broader turmoil of the Watergate scandal, created a political environment in which Congress could no longer look away from the intelligence community's abuses. On January 27, 1975, the United States Senate voted 82-4 to establish the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. The committee would become known simply as the Church Committee, after its chairman, Senator Frank Church of Idaho. What the Church Committee uncovered over the course of its 16-month investigation was far worse than even the most cynical observers had imagined. The committee didn't just investigate one agency or one program. It pulled back the curtain on the entire American intelligence apparatus, and what it found was a decades-long pattern of unconstitutional behavior by the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and even the Internal Revenue Service. The CIA had been opening and photographing more than 215,000 pieces of private mail in a program called HT Lingual, with agents literally sneaking envelopes out of post offices at night, stuffing them in briefcases, and steaming them open in back rooms. The agency had also been conducting experiments on unwitting American citizens under a program called MK-Ultra, which involved the administration of mind-altering drugs, including LSD, without the subject's knowledge or consent. The FBI's COINTELPRO operations were documented in exhaustive detail, revealing the wiretapping of Martin Luther King Jr. and the systematic harassment of civil rights leaders. The committee found that intelligence agencies had been acting as if the Constitution simply didn't apply to them, conducting surveillance, infiltration, and disruption campaigns against Americans who were doing nothing more than exercising their First Amendment rights. When Senator Walter Mondale asked during the hearings whether the NSA could be used by a future president to spy upon the American people and to chill and interrupt political dissent, the question hung in the air like a warning. The Church Committee's investigation also dragged the NSA into the public spotlight for the first time. Until 1975, the agency had been so secretive that many Americans didn't even know it existed. The joke in intelligence circles was that NSA stood for No Such Agency. Its headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland, didn't even appear on public maps. The committee exposed both Shamrock and Minaret, revealing the scale of the NSA's domestic surveillance activities to a stunned public. NSA Director Lou Allen was hauled before Congress and forced to acknowledge publicly, for the first time in the agency's history, that the NSA had been collecting the communications of American citizens. The resulting public outrage led to real legislative reform. In 1978, Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, known as FISA, which created a special secret court, the FISA Court, to oversee intelligence agencies' requests for domestic surveillance warrants. The goal was to ensure that what had happened under Shamrock and Minaret and COINTELPRO could never happen again. For a time, the reform seemed to work. The intelligence agencies were put on notice that Congress was watching, and the FISA court provided at least a veneer of judicial oversight. But the story of government surveillance was far from over. Even as the Church Committee reforms were taking hold in the United States, a far more ambitious surveillance operation was quietly taking shape on the global stage. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the intelligence agencies of 5 English-speaking nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, had been building something unprecedented. These 5 countries, bound together by a secret intelligence sharing agreement dating back to 1946 called the UK-USA Agreement, were constructing a worldwide network of listening stations capable of intercepting satellite communications, telephone calls, fax transmissions, and eventually internet traffic from virtually anywhere on the planet. The system was given the code name Echelon. The way Echelon worked was elegant in its ambition and terrifying in its implications. Ground-based signal stations were positioned at strategic locations around the world: Menwith Hill in the United Kingdom, Pine Gap in Australia, Waihopai in New Zealand, Leitrim in Canada, and multiple facilities across the United States. Each station was responsible for intercepting communications from a specific geographic region. The raw data collected by these stations was then fed into a network of supercomputers that scanned the traffic for specific keywords, names, phone numbers, and other identifiers that the intelligence agencies deemed relevant. Any communication that triggered a match was flagged and forwarded to analysts for closer examination. What made Echelon particularly insidious was its potential for abuse. Because the UK-USA agreement allowed the 5 nations to share intelligence freely, the system could theoretically be used to circumvent domestic laws against spying on one's own citizens. If the NSA was prohibited from intercepting the phone calls of an American citizen, it could simply ask Britain's GCHQ to do it, and then share the results. This arrangement, which Edward Snowden would later describe as a supranational intelligence organization that does not answer to the known laws of its own countries, meant that the protections put in place by the Church Committee could be neatly sidestepped. The first person to publicly reveal Echelon's existence was a former NSA analyst named Perry Fellwach. Writing under the pseudonym Winslow Peck, Fellwach published an article in the magazine Ramparts in 1972 that described the existence of a global network of listening posts and detailed his experiences working within the system. His revelations were largely ignored at the time, buried beneath the avalanche of other scandals consuming the nation during the Watergate era. But Fellwach wasn't the only insider who would break ranks. In 1988, a former Lockheed employee named Margaret Newsham provided testimony to members of Congress about Echelon's operations, describing from first-hand experience how the system was being used to intercept the private telephone conversations of an American senator. Newsham had worked at the Menwith Hill listening station in Yorkshire, England, and at the time of her testimony, she was one of the very few people who had seen the system in operation from the inside and was willing to talk about it. Her account was critical in lending credibility to a story that many people still dismissed as paranoia. That same year, British investigative journalist Duncan Campbell published a landmark article in the New Statesman magazine titled "Somebody's Listening," in which he provided the first detailed public account of Echelon and its capabilities. Campbell's reporting was groundbreaking, but it was still treated with skepticism by many who found it difficult to believe that such a system could exist. Campbell himself would face legal pressure for his reporting, having been arrested and charged under the Official Secrets Act in a previous case known as the ABC trial in 1978, where he was prosecuted alongside a former signals intelligence officer for reporting on GCHQ's activities. Though the case ultimately collapsed, it demonstrated the lengths to which governments would go to keep surveillance programs hidden. Then, in 1996, New Zealand journalist Nikki Hager published a book called Secret Power that provided an even more detailed description of Echelon, drawing on sources within New Zealand's intelligence community. Hager's book helped convince the European Parliament to take the matter seriously, and in 2000, the Parliament established a temporary committee on the Echelon interception system to investigate. The committee's 2001 report concluded that Echelon's existence was no longer in doubt and expressed deep concern about the implications for the privacy of European citizens. The committee even sent a delegation to Washington to meet with American intelligence officials, but every single meeting was canceled by the US. Government and the delegation was forced to return home empty-handed. While journalists were slowly pulling back the curtain on Echelon from the outside, another kind of whistleblower was emerging from within the very heart of the American intelligence establishment. William Binney was a mathematician from rural Pennsylvania who had spent more than 30 years at the NSA, rising through the ranks to become one of the agency's most respected technical minds. He co-founded the Signals Intelligence Automation Research Center, a 6,000-person operations unit, and served as the technical director of the agency's World Geopolitical and Military Analysis Division. In the late 1990s, Binney and a small team of specialists developed a program called Thin Thread that represented a fundamentally different approach to signals intelligence. Thin Thread was designed to collect and analyze massive volumes of communications data while simultaneously protecting the privacy of American citizens. The system worked by automatically encrypting any identifying information belonging to U.S. persons, so that analysts could examine patterns in the data without knowing who the individuals were. If analysts found something suspicious, they would need to obtain a court order to decrypt the identity, thereby preserving Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. It was elegant, it was effective, and in late 2000, the system was up and running at 3 separate NSA sites, processing data 24 hours a day. But the NSA leadership had other plans. Rather than deploy Thin Thread, the agency chose to pursue a far more expensive program called Trailblazer, which was contracted out to the Science Applications International Corporation for an initial cost of $280 million. Unlike Thin Thread, which had been developed in-house for a fraction of the cost, Trailblazer was bloated, ineffective, and years behind schedule. More critically, it lacked Thin Thread's built-in privacy protections. Binney later described the decision as one driven by empire building. More contractors meant more contracts, which meant more money and a bigger budget for NSA leadership. Thin Thread was officially shelved 3 weeks before September 11, 2001. Binney has maintained ever since that if the system had been deployed as planned, the NSA would have had the analytical tools necessary to detect the hijackers' communications and potentially prevent the attacks. Thomas Drake, another NSA whistleblower who later obtained permission to run Thin Thread against the agency's existing data from early 2002, confirmed that the system identified communications that should have alerted analysts to the plot. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks, as the nation reeled and the intelligence community scrambled for answers, the NSA launched a new program codenamed Stellar Wind. Binney learned about it when members of his Thin Thread team were drafted to work on the new system and came to him, alarmed by what they were being asked to do. What Binney heard confirmed his worst fears. Stellar Wind was essentially a stripped-down version of Thin Thread, but with all of the privacy protections ripped out. The encryption that protected American identities was gone. The filtering that targeted only relevant communications was gone. In its place was a dragnet that vacuumed up everything, recording 320 million calls per day at its outset, and eventually expanding to encompass what Binney estimates was between 15 and 20 trillion communications transactions. Unable to remain at the NSA in good conscience, Binney resigned on October 31, 2001, along with his colleague J. Kirk Wiebe. In 2002, they filed a formal complaint with the Department of Defense Inspector General, alleging massive waste, fraud, and abuse in the NSA's surveillance programs. The complaint named the Trailblazer boondoggle specifically and detailed the constitutional violations inherent in Stellar Wind. And for their trouble, the whistleblowers were rewarded with the full force of the federal government's retaliatory apparatus. In 2007, the FBI raided Binney's home. Agents arrived at dawn, pointed guns at Binney and his family as he stepped out of the shower, and confiscated his computers and documents. The same treatment was visited upon Weba Diane Rourke, a Republican staffer on the House Intelligence Committee who had supported their complaints, and Edward Loomis, another former NSA official involved in Thin Thread's development. Binney was never charged with a crime, but the raid destroyed his consulting business and sent a clear message to anyone else who might consider speaking out. As Binney later put it, describing the scope of the NSA's surveillance capabilities, it's better than anything that the KGB, the Stasi, or the Gestapo and SS ever had. While Binney and Wiebe were fighting the NSA from the outside, a quieter but equally significant battle was being waged by a man who had never planned to become a whistleblower at all. Mark Klein was a telecommunications technician who had worked for AT&T for more than 22 years, starting in New York in 1981 and eventually transferring to the company's operations in California. He was a union man, a master of his craft, a career technician who spent his days maintaining the equipment that kept the nation's communications infrastructure running. He was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a radical. In late 2002, Klein began to notice something strange at AT&T's central office at 611 Folsom Street in San Francisco. NSA operatives had arrived at the facility and were building a new room on the 6th floor, right next door to the main telecommunications switching room. The room was designated 641A, and from the beginning, it was shrouded in secrecy. Only one person, a management-level employee with special NSA security clearance, was allowed to enter the room. No union workers, no regular technicians, nobody without specific authorization could even approach its door. Klein began to grow suspicious. His suspicions deepened when he was assigned to connect circuits carrying internet data to optical splitters that sat just outside room 641A, but were hardwired directly into it. Klein understood exactly what those splitters did. They made an identical copy of every piece of data flowing through those circuits, every email, every web search, every file transfer, and funneled that copy directly into the secret room. This meant that the NSA was not targeting specific individuals or specific communications. It was copying everything. Every byte of internet traffic that passed through AT&T's San Francisco facility was being duplicated and handed over to the government. Klein also found documents indicating that similar installations existed in other AT&T facilities across the country. This was not a targeted intelligence operation. It was mass surveillance on a scale that most Americans would have found inconceivable. Klein kept copies of the technical documents, the wiring diagrams, and the schematic blueprints that proved what was happening, and he waited. He waited because he was afraid, and he waited because he wasn't sure what to do. It wasn't until late 2005 when the New York Times published a story revealing that the Bush administration had been conducting warrantless surveillance of American citizens that Klein finally decided to act. He went first to the press, but the experience was frustrating. One newspaper strung him along for months, promising a front-page story, and then killed it. Other outlets refused to touch his revelations. Finally, Klein walked up to the front door of the Electronic Frontier Foundation in San Francisco, rang the bell and said, "You folks care about privacy?" They did. Klein handed over more than 100 pages of authenticated AT&T schematic diagrams and technical documents that proved the NSA was tapping into the backbone of the American internet. The EFF used Klein's evidence to file 2 landmark lawsuits, Hepting v. AT&T and Joule v. NSA. The first was a class action suit on behalf of AT&T customers whose privacy had been violated. The second was a direct challenge to the NSA's surveillance program. But the legal victories that seemed within reach were snatched away when Congress passed legislation retroactively granting telecommunications companies immunity from lawsuits if they had cooperated with government surveillance programs. The Hepting case was effectively killed, and Jules Verne's NSA was dismissed, on the technical grounds that the plaintiffs couldn't prove they had personally been surveilled. A catch-22 that left Klein deeply frustrated. Mark Klein passed away on March 8, 2025, at the age of 79. His contributions to the public understanding of government surveillance finally beginning to receive the recognition they deserved. While Klein was fighting to expose what AT&T and the NSA were doing to the nation's internet infrastructure, Thomas Drake was waging his own lonely battle from inside the NSA itself, and the price he would pay for speaking out would serve as a warning to every potential whistleblower in the American intelligence community. Drake was a decorated veteran of both the United States Air Force and the Navy, a computer and linguistics expert who had spent years working in various intelligence capacities before joining the NSA full-time in 2001. His first day on the job was September 11th, 2001, and what he encountered in the months that followed shook him to his core. Drake saw the same things that Binney and Wiebe had seen: the abandonment of thin thread in favor of the bloated and ineffective Trailblazer program, the launch of Stellar Wind with its wholesale collection of American communications, and the staggering waste of billions of taxpayer dollars on systems that didn't work while effective alternatives were deliberately shelved. But unlike Binney, who had resigned and filed his complaint from the outside, Drake tried to work within the system. He raised his concerns with his superiors at the NSA. He went to the NSA Inspector General. He contacted Diane Rourke on the House Intelligence Committee. He cooperated fully with the Department of Defense Inspector General's investigation that Binney and Wiebe had triggered. At every step, Drake followed the proper channels, did everything by the book, and was met with silence, indifference, or outright hostility. By 2006, frustrated and convinced that the internal mechanisms had failed completely, Drake made legal disclosures of unclassified information to Siobhan Gorman, a reporter at the Baltimore Sun. Gorman's resulting series of articles exposed the Trailblazer debacle and the NSA's broader dysfunction, drawing on multiple sources and never identifying Drake by name. But in 2007, the FBI came for Drake just as they had come for Binney. Armed agents raided his home, interrogated him for hours, and confiscated his computers and documents. The government created a draft indictment that listed Drake alongside Binney, Wiebe, and Rourke as unindicted co-conspirators. Drake was eventually charged under the Espionage Act of 1917, the same law that had been crafted to prosecute spies selling secrets to foreign governments. He faced 10 felony counts and the possibility of 35 years in prison. Drake refused to plead guilty. He refused to help prosecutors build cases against the other whistleblowers. He said publicly, "I've got a bullseye on my back. I did not tell secrets. I am facing prison for having raised an alarm, period." The government's case began to unravel when it became clear that many of the documents prosecutors claimed were classified were, in fact, unclassified, and that some had even been improperly classified after the fact to bolster the prosecution. In June 2011, all 10 original charges were dropped. The government agreed to let Drake plead to a single misdemeanor of exceeding authorized use of a government computer. The federal judge who oversaw the case was scathing in his criticism of the prosecution, calling the government's behavior, charging a defendant with serious crimes that could result in decades in prison, only to drop them at the last minute, unconscionable. but the damage was done. Drake's career in intelligence was over. Unable to find work in the field he had dedicated his life to, the former NSA senior executive took a job at an Apple store in Bethesda, Maryland. Edward Snowden would later point to Drake's case as the defining factor in his own decision to bypass internal channels and go directly to the press. "We had a guy who did absolutely everything right," Snowden said. "He placed his faith in the system and they actively retaliated against him. It's fair to say that if there hadn't been a Thomas Drake, there couldn't have been an Edward Snowden." And then there was Snowden. Edward Joseph Snowden was born on June 21, 1983, in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, and grew up in a family with a long tradition of government service. His father served in the Coast Guard, his mother worked as a clerk at the federal courthouse, and his grandfather had been a rear admiral in the Coast Guard and worked at the FBI and the Pentagon. Snowden attended community college but never completed a traditional degree, instead teaching himself computer programming and systems administration with a skill that caught the attention of the intelligence community. In 2006, he was hired by the CIA, and by 2009, he had moved to Dell, where he managed computer systems for the NSA. Over the following years, as Snowden worked his way deeper into the intelligence community, moving from the CIA to Dell to a position as a systems administrator in Hawaii, he gained access to a breathtaking array of classified documents that painted a picture of a surveillance apparatus operating far beyond what any member of the public could have imagined. And the more he saw, the more disturbed he became. The moment that Snowden later described as his breaking point came on March 12, 2013, when he watched the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Senator Ron Wyden asked Clapper directly, "Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?" Clapper's response was immediate and unequivocal. "No, sir, not wittingly." Snowden knew that this was a lie. He had seen the documents proving that the NSA was doing exactly what Clapper had denied, and the Director of National Intelligence had just lied to Congress under oath, on camera, without hesitation. 3 days later, Snowden quit his job at Dell. He then took a position at Booz Allen Hamilton, another NSA contractor, with the specific purpose of gathering additional documents to prove the scope of the government's surveillance programs. He spent roughly 2 months at Booz Allen, carefully selecting documents that he believed demonstrated unconstitutional activity and that the American public had a right to know about. He later emphasized that he did not indiscriminately download everything he could find, saying, "I carefully evaluated every single document I disclosed to ensure that each was legitimately in the public interest." In May 2013, Snowden took emergency leave from his job, citing treatment for epilepsy, and flew to Hong Kong. In the weeks before his departure, he had made preparations that carried the weight of finality. He emptied his bank account and filled an old steel ammunition box with cash for his girlfriend Lindsay Mills to find later. He erased and encrypted his old computers. He went on what he would later describe as a bender of household repairs, fixing doors, changing light bulbs, taking care of all the small domestic tasks he knew he would never return to complete. Everything was imbued with a sense of ending, Snowden would later write in his memoir, Permanent Record, and yet there were moments when it seemed that no end was in sight. He left without telling Mills where he was going, or why, believing that the less she knew, the safer she would be when the government inevitably came looking. He had already been in contact with 2 journalists, documentary filmmaker Laura Poitras and columnist Glenn Greenwald, who was then writing for the Guardian newspaper. Snowden had initially tried to reach Greenwald directly through anonymous encrypted emails, but had struggled for weeks to get the journalist to install the encryption software necessary for secure communication. Greenwald, overwhelmed with correspondence and unfamiliar with the technical requirements, kept putting it off, not realizing that the source on the other end was sitting on the biggest intelligence leak in American history. It was Poitras, who had already been working on a documentary about surveillance and had reported extensively on William Binney, who proved to be the more receptive conduit. Snowden had chosen the codename Citizen 4 for his communications with Poitras, a name that was itself a tribute to the 3 NSA whistleblowers who had come before him, Binney, Wiebe, and Drake. He chose Hong Kong as his destination carefully, believing that the semi-autonomous Chinese territory offered both a robust tradition of free speech and enough political independence from Beijing to resist an immediate extradition request from Washington. On June 2, 2013, Greenwald and Poitras, along with Guardian reporter Ewan MacAskill, arrived in Hong Kong and met Snowden for the first time at the Mira Hotel in Kowloon. They had no idea what to expect. They didn't know how old their source was, what he looked like, or even his gender. Snowden had told them only that they would recognize him because he would be holding a Rubik's Cube in his left hand. Greenwald and Poitras had expected someone older, someone in their 50s, perhaps a grizzled intelligence veteran. Instead, they found a 29-year-old sitting calmly in his hotel room, pillows wedged against the door to prevent eavesdropping, surrounded by laptops and the weight of what he was about to do. Over the next 8 days, Snowden methodically walked the journalists through the documents, explaining the technical details of programs that would soon become household names. Poitras filmed the conversations, footage that would later form the backbone of her Academy Award-winning documentary, Citizen 4. At night, Greenwald and MacAskill would retreat to write up the day's revelations, while Poitras edited video and coordinated remotely with Washington Post journalist Barton Gellman, who had also received documents from Snowden. On June 5, 2013, The Guardian published the first story. It revealed that the NSA had obtained a secret court order from the FISA court requiring Verizon to hand over the metadata of all of its customers' phone calls, the numbers dialed, the duration of calls, the times they were placed, and location data on an ongoing daily basis. The order covered more than 120 million Verizon subscribers. The next day, June 6th, both The Guardian and The Washington Post published stories about PRISM, a program under which the NSA collected internet communications directly from the servers of 9 major American technology companies, including Microsoft, Google, Apple, Yahoo, Facebook, YouTube, Skype, AOL, and Paltalk. Under PRISM, the NSA could access emails, photographs, video and voice chats, file transfers, social networking details, and other stored data. The FISA court had authorized the program, and the companies were legally compelled to comply and legally forbidden from telling their users that their data was being turned over to the government. A leaked internal NSA presentation boasted that PRISM was the most used signals intelligence source in NSA reporting. The revelations kept coming week after week, month after month, each one peeling back another layer of a surveillance apparatus that seemed to have no boundaries. There was X Keyscore, described internally as the NSA's Google, a search engine that allowed analysts to search through the vast pools of data collected by PRISM and other programs with nothing more than an email address or a name. An internal NSA training presentation boasted that X-Keyscore covered nearly everything a typical user does on the internet, and that analysts could begin searching databases with no prior authorization, needing only to fill out a simple on-screen form to justify the query after the fact. There was Boundless Informant, a data mining tool that allowed the NSA to track and visualize the volume of its global data collection, showing that by March 2013, the agency had collected 97 billion pieces of intelligence from global computer networks in a single month. There was Tempora, an electronic surveillance program operated by Britain's GCHQ that tapped directly into more than 200 fiber optic cables carrying internet traffic in and out of the United Kingdom, storing the content of communications for 3 days and the metadata for 30 days, and sharing it all with the NSA. There was Muscular, a joint NSA-GCHQ program that allegedly collected twice as much data per day as PRISM and operated by hacking directly into the internal communications links of companies like Google and Yahoo, without their knowledge or cooperation, intercepting data as it moved between the company's own data centers. And the programs went far beyond internet and phone surveillance. Snowden's documents revealed a program called Dishfire that collected and stored hundreds of millions of text messages from around the world every single day, sweeping them up indiscriminately whether or not the sender or recipient had any connection to a security threat. Analysts could then search those stored messages by phone number, keyword, location data, or content, extracting everything from personal contacts and travel plans to financial transactions. There was Optic Nerve, a GCHQ program conducted with NSA assistance that intercepted and stored webcam images from millions of Yahoo users, including a significant percentage that contained sexually explicit content from people who were not suspected of any wrongdoing whatsoever. In a single 6-month period in 2008, the program collected webcam imagery from more than 1.8 million Yahoo accounts globally. Perhaps most alarming were the revelations about the NSA's Tailored Access Operations Unit, known internally as TAO. This was the agency's elite hacking division, a team of specialists who could remotely break into virtually any computer system on Earth. TAO operatives intercepted computer equipment being shipped to targets, secretly installed surveillance software or hardware, and then repackaged and sent the equipment on its way. They exploited vulnerabilities in commercial routers, switches, and firewalls manufactured by companies like Cisco, Juniper, and Huawei. They even had a catalog of specialized spy tools, an internal shopping list that read like something from a spy novel, offering devices that could be implanted in USB cables, monitor screens, and computer hard drives, all designed to give the NSA invisible, persistent access to the target's digital life. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the scope of the collection. The Snowden documents revealed that the NSA was not merely targeting suspected terrorists or foreign intelligence threats. It was collecting communications data on a massive scale from ordinary citizens around the world, including Americans, with minimal oversight and virtually no accountability. Analysts operated under a standard that required only 51% confidence that a surveillance target was not an American citizen, a coin flip level of certainty that virtually guaranteed vast quantities of Americans' data would be swept up in the dragnet. Internal NSA documents showed that the agency had been surveilling foreign leaders, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel, as well as international organizations like UNICEF and Doctors Without Borders. On June 9, 2013, 4 days after the first story broke, Snowden went public. In a video interview filmed by Poitras at the Mira Hotel, he identified himself as the source of the leaks. He was calm, articulate, and clearly aware of what lay ahead. "I'm not going to let you bully me into silence like you have everyone else," he said, addressing the NSA directly. He explained that he had no intention of hiding, that he wanted the focus to remain on the substance of the revelations rather than on himself, and that he believed the American public deserved to know what was being done in their name. The United States government moved quickly. On June 14th, prosecutors charged Snowden with espionage and theft of government property, charges that could carry up to 30 years in prison. His passport was canceled. The government pressured Hong Kong authorities to detain him, but on June 23rd, Snowden boarded an Aeroflot flight from Hong Kong to Moscow, accompanied by WikiLeaks legal advisor Sarah Harrison. The circumstances of his departure from Hong Kong remain murky. The Hong Kong government later said it had allowed Snowden to leave because the extradition paperwork from the United States contained errors and did not conform to Hong Kong law. American officials were furious, viewing the response as a deliberate snub. Snowden had planned to fly from Moscow to Ecuador, where he intended to seek asylum with a brief layover at Sheremetyevo International Airport. But when his plane landed, he was stranded. Without a valid passport, he couldn't board a connecting flight, and the United States had put immense diplomatic pressure on every country along his potential flight path. Vice President Joe Biden personally called the president of Ecuador to discourage the country from granting asylum. France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy all closed their airspace to a plane carrying the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, on suspicion that Snowden might be on board, an incident that drew widespread international condemnation. For 40 days, Snowden lived in the airport's transit zone, sleeping on benches and eating from the terminal's food court. A man without a country, trapped between the nation that wanted to imprison him and a world that didn't know what to do with him. On August 1st, 2013, the Russian government granted Snowden temporary asylum, and he has remained in Russia ever since, eventually receiving Russian citizenship in 2022. The impact of Snowden's revelations was seismic and far-reaching, rippling outward from Washington to virtually every capital on Earth. Within the United States, the leaks triggered a public debate about surveillance and privacy that had not occurred since the Church Committee hearings of 1975. Polls showed that Americans were deeply divided, with roughly half believing that Snowden's disclosures served the public interest, and roughly half believing they harmed national security. But the legal and legislative consequences were undeniable. The international fallout was equally dramatic. When documents revealed that the NSA had been tapping German Chancellor Angela Merkel's personal mobile phone, Merkel responded with a public rebuke that strained the transatlantic alliance, declaring that spying among friends is simply unacceptable. Brazil's president, Dilma Rousseff, canceled a planned state visit to Washington after learning that the NSA had intercepted her personal communications and spied on the Brazilian state oil company Petrobras. The European Union launched multiple investigations into the surveillance of its citizens and institutions. In country after country, from France to Indonesia, the Snowden documents forced governments to confront uncomfortable questions about their own intelligence agencies' cooperation with, or subjection to, the American surveillance machine. The journalism that emerged from Snowden's disclosures earned some of the highest honors in the profession. The Guardian and the Washington Post shared the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, awarded for exposing the widespread surveillance and helping to spark a huge public debate about the extent of the government's spying. Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, Barton Gellman, and Ewan McCaskill were named co-recipients of the 2013 George Polk Award, which they dedicated to Snowden. Poitras's documentary Citizen 4 won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 2015. And yet, remarkably, the vast majority of Snowden's archive has never been published. Ewan MacAskill, one of the 3 journalists who met Snowden in Hong Kong, confirmed in 2023 that only about 1% of the documents have ever been made public. What the remaining 99% contains remains unknown. In December 2013, a federal district court judge ruled that the NSA's bulk collection of phone metadata was likely unconstitutional, calling the program almost Orwellian in its scope. In May 2015, a federal appeals court went further, ruling that the bulk collection was unlawful, finding that the NSA had exceeded the authority granted to it by Congress under the Patriot Act. These legal victories set the stage for Congress to act. On June 2, 2015, President Barack Obama signed the USA Freedom Act into law. The legislation permanently banned the bulk collection of phone records by the NSA and other intelligence agencies, required the government to use specific search terms rather than dragnet collection methods, and increased the transparency of the FISA court by requiring the appointment of independent advocates to argue for civil liberties protections. The NSA's bulk phone metadata program was officially shut down on November 28, 2015. But the reforms, while significant, were far from complete. The USA Freedom Act did not address Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act, the legal authority that underpinned PRISM and other programs targeting the communications of non-Americans. It did not constrain the NSA's collection of data under Executive Order 12333, the primary authority used to justify mass surveillance of people outside U.S. borders. And it did not prevent the government from continuing to access Americans' data through backdoor searches of information collected under these other authorities. Privacy advocates noted that while the Freedom Act was a milestone, it was at best an incomplete first step. The Snowden revelations also prompted major changes in the technology industry, changes that continue to shape the digital world today. Companies that had been publicly embarrassed by their inclusion on the PRISM slides began aggressively encrypting their communications. Google expedited a project to encrypt all traffic moving between its data centers, a direct response to the muscular revelation that the NSA had been tapping those very links. Apple introduced full disk encryption on its iPhones by default, making it mathematically impossible for even Apple itself to unlock a customer's device for law enforcement without the user's passcode. The adoption of end-to-end encryption in messaging applications like Signal became widespread, driven in large part by the public's newfound awareness of just how thoroughly their communications could be monitored. Even the basic architecture of the internet shifted. Before Snowden, the majority of web traffic was unencrypted, meaning that anyone with access to the right network equipment could read it in plain text. After Snowden, the adoption of HTTPS encryption accelerated dramatically, and today, the vast majority of web traffic is encrypted by default. The tech companies also fought back in the courts and in Congress. Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Apple, Yahoo, and other major firms formed a coalition called the Reform Government Surveillance Alliance, lobbying for greater transparency about government data requests and for limits on bulk collection. Several companies began publishing transparency reports detailing the number and type of government surveillance orders they received, forcing a degree of public accountability that had never existed before. The revelations had shattered the implicit trust between Silicon Valley and the intelligence community, and the relationship has never fully recovered. And perhaps most important of all, the revelations changed the way ordinary people thought about their digital lives. Before Snowden, the idea that the government might be reading your emails or tracking your phone calls was dismissed by many as the province of conspiracy theorists. After Snowden, it was simply a fact. Surveys conducted by the Pew Research Center in the years following the disclosures found that roughly 1 in 4 Americans who were aware of the surveillance programs had changed the way they used technology as a result, altering privacy settings, avoiding certain search terms, or switching to encrypted communication tools. The United Nations passed its first ever resolution on the right to privacy in the digital age, and human rights organizations around the world began to incorporate digital surveillance into their frameworks for protecting civil liberties. A generation of young people grew up understanding, perhaps for the first time, that their phones and laptops were not just tools for communication, but potential instruments of surveillance. The story of mass surveillance and the whistleblowers who exposed it is ultimately a story about the tension at the heart of every democracy. The tension between the government's desire to keep its citizens safe and the citizens' right to be free from unwarranted intrusion into their private lives. From the intercepted telegrams of Project Shamrock to the fiber optic splitters of Room 641A, from the watch lists of Minaret to the global dragnet of Prism, the pattern has repeated itself across decades. Governments build surveillance systems in secret. Those systems inevitably expand beyond their original purpose, and it falls to ordinary people, technicians and analysts and activists to risk everything in order to tell the public the truth. Whether you see these whistleblowers as patriots or traitors, the world they revealed is one that belongs to all of us, and the question of how much privacy we are willing to surrender in the name of security is one that each of us must answer for ourselves. If you found this exploration thought-provoking and you'd like to hear more stories like this, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to Unexplained Mysteries for Sleep. It helps us more than you know and keeps these deep dives coming your way. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.